The millionaire vanished into the waters without anyone understanding. The current carried him away, and he woke up in an unlikely place. A beggar woman stared at him and said, "I did this because..." and her reason will turn your world upside down. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. Richard Montgomery stepped onto the fine sand of that deserted beach, feeling the salty wind tousle his perfectly trimmed hair. His loosened Italian silk tie was the only sign that something was amiss. For a man who commanded a billion-dollar business empire, this forgotten corner of the Massachusetts coast seemed an unlikely place. But he needed solitude, needed silence to organize his thoughts after the catastrophic meeting with shareholders. The empire he had built over 2 decades was teetering, and the blame was entirely his. The sky darkened rapidly. Heavy clouds announced an approaching storm. Richard ignored the signs. He walked to the rocks as the tide rose aggressively. The waves broke with increasing force. He felt the icy water soak his $5,000 Italian shoes. He didn't care. His cell phone rang for the 10th time. It was Helen, his assistant. He ignored it again. The churning sea hypnotized him. In a moment of distraction, a stronger wave knocked him off balance. Richard slipped on the wet rocks. He felt his body being pulled by the violent current. He tried to swim against the force of the water, but the current was stronger. His clothes weighed him down. The linen suit hindered his movements. The last thing he saw was the dark sky and the raindrops that had begun to fall. Darkness. Richard opened his eyes slowly. His body ached. He was lying on cardboard. A worn blanket covered him. He didn't recognize the place. A zinc roof, walls of improvised wood, the smell of sea air still present. He tried to get up, but dizziness forced him back down. "Stay still. You almost didn't make it." The female voice surprised him. He looked to the side and saw a woman sitting on a wooden stool, disheveled gray hair, worn and patched clothes, deep, intense brown eyes that stared at him without wavering. Where am I?" asked Richard, his voice hoarse. "In my house," she replied, extending a cup of water. "Drink." He hesitated, but thirst was stronger. He accepted the cup and drank eagerly. "Who are you?" he asked as he returned the empty cup. "They call me Constance, but that doesn't matter now." She stood up, revealing herself to be taller than she appeared when seated. "I saw you on the rocks, saw when the water took you. I managed to pull you out before it was too late." Richard looked at his clothes. They were dry, but they weren't his. He wore faded sweatpants and a gray t-shirt. "My clothes? They were soaked. I threw them away." "Threw them away?" Richard became agitated. "That suit cost more than 10,000? 15,000? What does it matter? It was just a piece of wet cloth." Constance interrupted him without being fazed. "Your watch is over there." She pointed to a small improvised nightstand made of crates. Richard stretched his arm and picked up the watch. A platinum Patek Philippe that cost more than many people. Earned in years of work, at least that was saved. "My phone?" "The sea took it, couldn't save it." Richard felt panic rising. No phone, no contacts, no identity. How would he get back to New York? How would he explain his sudden disappearance after the disastrous meeting? "I need to go. I need to get back to New York urgently." He tried to stand again, but dizziness knocked him back down. "You're not going anywhere today," Constance stated with surprising authority. "You hit your head on the rocks. You need to rest." "Ma'am, you don't understand. I'm Richard Montgomery. I have a company to run. People depend on me. Thousands of jobs are at stake." Constance smiled, an enigmatic smile that disconcerted him. "I know exactly who you are, Richard Montgomery, and that's why I saved you." The businessman frowned, confused. "What do you mean? You know me?" "More than you imagine." She walked to the improvised window and looked at the sea, now calm under the starry night sky. "I've been watching you for a long time, Richard. The great businessman, the visionary. The man they say has the Midas touch." The ironic tone didn't go unnoticed. "What are you talking about? How could a..." He hesitated, searching for a less offensive word. "How could you know me?" "A homeless woman. Is that what you were going to say?" She turned, her eyes shining, in a way that intimidated him. Not everything is what it seems, Richard. I did this to save you, not from the sea, but from yourself. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something about this woman, something he couldn't decipher, an intelligence in her eyes, a posture that didn't match the worn clothes. Tomorrow, she continued, you'll have a choice. You can take that expensive watch, sell it, buy new clothes, and return to your usual life. Or you can stay and discover why fate brought you to me. This is absurd. There's no such thing as fate. There are choices and consequences. Richard tried to sound confident, but his voice trembled. Then consider this a consequence of your choices, Richard Montgomery. Constance moved away from the window and picked up an old folded blanket from the corner. Sleep. Tomorrow we'll talk more. She lay down on a mat on the floor on the other side of the small room, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. Lying on that improvised mattress under an unfamiliar roof, the businessman contemplated the abyss that had opened in his life. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from the luxury of his Park Avenue penthouse to a shack by the sea, saved by a strange woman who seemed to know too much about him. Sleep eventually overcame him, lulled by the sound of the waves and the unanswered questions hammering in his mind. The sun was already high when Richard woke up. His body still ached, but the dizziness had passed. He got up slowly, observing his surroundings better. A simple but surprisingly clean and organized single room. Improvised shelves held books, real books, not old magazines or newspapers as he would have expected to find in the home of someone living on the margins of society. Constance wasn't there. Richard took his watch and put it on his wrist, the familiar weight bringing some comfort. He walked to the door and opened it. The bright sunlight temporarily blinded him. When his eyes adjusted, he saw where he was, a small shack built on the slope of a hill overlooking an isolated beach. No other buildings were visible. In the distance, he could see a dirt road winding up the hill. Finally awake. Constance's voice came from behind him. Richard turned and saw her coming up a narrow path, carrying a woven straw bag. Brought coffee and bread. She passed him and entered the shack. It's not your imported gourmet coffee, but it'll satisfy your hunger. Richard followed her inside, intrigued by the knowledge she seemed to have about his habits. How do you know about my coffee? Constance placed the bag on an improvised table made of a board resting on two sawhorses. She took out a thermos and 2 loaves of bread from the bag. I know many things about you, Richard. I know you were born in Riverdale, upstate New York. I know you lost your father at 12 and that your mother had to work 2 jobs to support you and your younger brother, Gabriel. Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. How do you know about Gabriel? Gabriel was a subject he had avoided for years. The brother who disappeared at 18 after a terrible fight between them. The brother whom Richard, in his youthful pride, never looked for. The brother who had become a ghost in his life. Drink your coffee, replied Constance, ignoring his question. We need to talk. She served the coffee in 2 chipped mugs. Richard accepted one, watching her carefully. In the daylight, he could see details he hadn't noticed the night before. Constance's hands, though calloused, had well-kept nails. Her posture was erect, almost aristocratic, completely at odds with her worn clothes. Who are you really? Asked Richard, holding the mug without drinking. Someone who has known the other side of the coin, Richard. The side you never wanted to see. Stop with the riddles. If you know so much about me, be direct. Constance smiled. That same enigmatic smile from the night before. 15 years ago, I was the financial director of Vega Systems, remember it? Richard almost choked on the sip of coffee he had finally taken. Vega Systems was one of the first companies he acquired in his climb to success, a small technology company with promising patents. Impossible. I know all the executives of the companies I acquired. You know those who remained after the restructuring, not those who were discarded even before you took control. The memory came like lightning. In the acquisition of Vega, Richard had ordered the dismissal of the entire board even before finalizing the purchase, a strategy to avoid internal resistance. He didn't remember the names or faces. To him, they were just numbers on a spreadsheet. Constance. That's not your real name, is it? Constance Vega, she pronounced the name with a slight Hispanic accent. Founder of Vega Systems, along with my late husband. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Vega Systems had been founded by a couple of engineers. He vaguely remembered reading this in the acquisition report, but he never met them personally. The negotiation was conducted by intermediaries. This doesn't make sense. The owner of Vega Systems would be rich, successful like you? She laughed, a bitter laugh. My husband became ill during the negotiation. Terminal cancer. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't risk the sale not happening. We needed the money for his treatment. Richard set the mug on the table, trying to organize his thoughts. But the sale was completed. You received millions. We did. And then your team of lawyers found a clause in the contract, a tax irregularity from years before, when we were just a startup struggling to survive. You triggered the penalty clause, froze the payments. The memory was now clear. It had been one of his first major moves in the market. Analysts applauded him for his cunning, reducing the acquisition value by more than 70% due to a legal technicality. It was business, nothing personal. The words sounded hollow even to himself. Business? Constance stared at him intensely. My husband died without proper treatment. I lost everything trying to save him. Home, possessions, dignity. When I finally managed to prove in court that the irregularity was insignificant, you had already extracted everything of value from the company and closed it. The compensation I received barely covered the debts I had accumulated. Richard looked away, unable to face her accusing eyes. Why did you save me then? Why not let the sea take me? Because I'm not like you, Richard. She stood up, imposing despite her simple clothes. And because you deserve something worse than a quick end. You deserve to face what you've done, not just to me, but to so many others. Fear gave way to indignation. So that's it? An elaborate revenge? Kidnapping me and keeping me here against my will? Kidnapping? Constance laughed. The door is open, Richard. Your precious watch is on your wrist. You can leave whenever you want. Return to your empire, which, according to the newspapers, is crumbling after your mysterious fall. Richard froze. What do you know about my company? I know the stock plummeted 30% yesterday after you disappeared from the meeting with investors. I know your competitors are moving in for a hostile takeover. I know your unexpected absence is being interpreted as flight or... She hesitated. Something worse. I need to go back. Now. Richard stood up abruptly. This is madness. I have... responsibilities. Yes, you do. Constance agreed calmly. More than you imagine. That's why I'm offering you a choice. What choice? Return to New York today. Reclaim your empire. Continue being who you've always been. She pointed to the open door. Or stay. For 3 months. Live without your name, without your power, without your money. See the world through. Have the eyes of those you've always ignored. And then if you still want to, you can return with everything you left behind. This is absurd. 3 months. My company won't survive 3 days without me. Then perhaps it's not as solid a company as you thought, Constance shrugged. But if you stay, I promise that at the end of 3 months, I'll give you something worth more than all your billions. What? The truth, Richard. About your brother Gabriel. About your own story. And about the legacy you'll really leave in this world. Richard felt his heart race. Gabriel. The name no one dared mention in his presence for more than 20 years. The wound that had never completely healed. How? How can you know something about Gabriel that I don't know? Stay and you'll find out. Constance walked to the door. I'm going to town to get more supplies. When I return, I want your answer. If you decide to leave, I won't stop you. But know that this will be your only chance to learn the truth. She left, leaving Richard alone with the turmoil of emotions and thoughts consuming him. The mention of Gabriel reopened old wounds. The younger brother, brilliant and idealistic, who had always criticized Richard's unbridled ambition. The last argument had been devastating. Gabriel had accused Richard of betraying his values, of becoming the kind of man their father had always despised. Richard had retaliated with cruelty, exposing what he considered his brother's weakness and envy. The next morning, Gabriel had left without warning, without goodbye. Just a note: when you realize what you've lost, it may be too late. Richard ran his hand through his hair, desperate. His company, his empire, his life were crumbling miles away. He needed to go back. It was the only logical choice. And yet, the promise of discovering Gabriel's whereabouts after so many years, of finally understanding what had happened to his brother, it was too powerful a bait to ignore. He walked to the small window of the shack. The blue sea stretched to the horizon, indifferent to human dilemmas, so different from the turbulent sea that had almost swallowed him. 3 months, he muttered to himself. 3 months against 20 years of doubt. The decision weighed on his chest like a stone. Constance returned at dusk, carrying a larger bag. She found Richard sitting on the small improvised porch of the shack, looking at the horizon. The luxury watch still on his wrist. "Looks like you decided to stay," she commented, setting the bag down beside him. "I haven't decided anything yet." Richard didn't look away from the ocean. "But I want to better understand the terms of this absurd agreement." "There are no complicated terms." Constance sat on a small stool beside him. "You'll live as Richard Smith, an ordinary man who lost everything and is starting over. No contact with your previous life, no using your money or influence. You'll work to support yourself like any normal person. And supposedly I'll learn great life lessons in this process." The sarcasm was evident in his voice. "I'm not offering lessons, Richard. I'm offering the truth. What you do with it afterward will be your choice." Richard finally turned to face. "Haritu, how can I trust you? You just admitted you have reasons to hate me." "I did." Constance picked up a worn book that was on top of the bag and opened it distractedly. "I spent years consumed by hatred, planning retaliation, dreaming of your downfall, until I realized it was destroying me more than you. The day I freed myself from that hatred, I truly began to live again." She handed the book to Richard. It was an old copy of The Little Prince. "If I wanted revenge, I would have let you disappear in that sea. Or I would have filmed your rescue and exposed your fragility to the world. I would destroy your reputation with a click." Richard looked at the book without understanding. "Why are you showing me this?" "Open to the marked page." He obeyed. Finding a highlighted passage, "You become responsible forever for what you have tamed." "Your brother Gabriel gave me this book," said Constance softly. Richard felt his blood freeze. "You knew Gabriel?" "Not only knew him, we worked together for years." The businessman held the book tightly, as if he could extract his brother's presence from it. "Where is he? Is he okay?" "That's part of what you'll discover during these 3 months if you accept my proposal." Constance gently removed the book from his tense hands. "Gabriel taught me that true change doesn't come from revenge or punishment, but from understanding." Richard took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. The possibility of finding his brother again, or at least discovering his whereabouts, was more powerful than any attachment to his previous life. "Very convenient, isn't it? Offering me information about Gabriel only if I accept your psychological game." "It's not a game, Richard, it's an opportunity. And as for Gabriel, this is the only way for you to truly understand what happened. If I simply told you, you wouldn't believe it. Or worse, you would believe, but wouldn't understand the meaning." Silence fell between them. The sound of waves breaking on the beach was the only soundtrack to Richard's whirlwind of thoughts. "If I accept," he finally said, "how will this work practically? I have no documents, clothes, nothing." Constance smiled, a genuine smile for the first time. "I'll provide what's necessary. I have more resources than I appear to. And when the 3 months are over, how do I know you'll keep your part?" "The same way I'll know if you've kept yours. Trust." She stood up and extended her hand. "So, do we have a deal?" Richard Smith looked at the extended hand, a calloused hand, but with the dignity of someone who had faced storms and remained standing. Slowly, Richard stood up as well. 3 months, he said, shaking her hand, "not a day more." "Great," Constance pointed to the bag. "I brought clothes for you. Tomorrow we begin." "Begin what?" Your new life. The sun had barely risen when Constance knocked on the door of the small room she had given to Richard. He had slept poorly, tormented by confused dreams where he saw Gabriel in the distance but could never reach him. "Get up," she called. "We have a long day ahead." Richard rose with difficulty. The thin mattress on wooden slats was far from the comfort of his king-size bed with imported orthopedic mattress. "What time is it?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Time to work. Get dressed." Entrées. A simple chair, he found new clothes. Basic jeans, white t-shirt, simple sneakers. Nothing that remotely resembled his designer wardrobe. When he came out of the room, he found Constance preparing a simple coffee. She was wearing different clothes too. Jeans, blue button-up shirt, hair tied in a discreet bun. She looked less like a homeless person and more like a retired teacher. "Eat quickly," she indicated, serving coffee and bread with butter. "The bus comes in 20 minutes." "Bus? Where are we going?" "To town. You need a job, Richard Smith." He swallowed the coffee hastily, burning his tongue in the process. "What kind of job will I get without documents, without a resume, without anything?" "The kind of job that millions of Americans get every day. Informal, poorly paid, exhausting." Constance handed him a small backpack. "Here's a water bottle, a notebook and a pen, basic for your first day." "First day as what?" "As a construction helper at the expansion project of the Sunrise Inn. The owner is an acquaintance of mine, said he needed another pair of hands." "Construction." Richard almost choked on his bread. "I've never worked with that in my life." "Exactly why you'll start as a helper, carrying cement bags, sand, bricks, heavy work that doesn't require experience, just strength and willingness." Richard felt a wave of panic. In his 50 years of life, he had never done manual labor. His calluses were from holding golf clubs, not construction tools. "This is ridiculous. I won't survive a day." "We'll see." Constance checked the simple watch on her wrist. "Let's go. The bus doesn't wait." Reluctantly, Richard followed her, along the trail that led to the main road. The small village he had glimpsed before was larger than he had imagined. A modest coastal community with simple houses, small businesses, and a central square. The bus stop was just a pole with a faded sign. Other workers were already waiting, talking among themselves. Some carried lunchboxes, others just water bottles like him. "You're new around here," commented a middle-aged man with sun-weathered skin. "I'm Joe Carter." Richard hesitated before extending his hand. "Richard Smith." "Also going to the in construction?" asked Joe. "Yes, as a helper." "Ah, you'll be working with Tony then. He's demanding but fair. If you do it right, he really teaches you the trade." Richard nodded, uncomfortable with the casual conversation. In his previous life, he rarely spoke with strangers who weren't executives, investors, or high-ranking employees. The bus arrived, old and noisy. Richard watched Constance pay the fares with some crumpled bills. Inside, all the seats were occupied. They stood, holding onto the leather straps worn from use. "When we arrive," whispered Constance, "you will be just Richard Smith. I am Constance, an old friend who is helping you start over after a series of setbacks. No details that might raise suspicions. What if someone recognizes me? My face has appeared in magazines and newspapers. In this part of the coast, far from the big centers, I doubt anyone reads Forbes or Fortune. And even if they've seen your face somewhere, no one would expect to find billionaire Richard Montgomery carrying cement bags." She was right, he realized. Context changed everything. How would someone expect to recognize a famous pianist working as a supermarket cashier? The scenario made identification unlikely. After 40 minutes of travel on dirt roads and poorly maintained asphalt, they arrived at a larger town. Not big enough to be considered urban, but with enough movement to have a small commercial center, some construction supply stores, and basic services. The Sunrise Inn was at the entrance to the town, overlooking the sea. It was a charming building, with 2 floors and a rustic style. At the back, a new wing was being built, with concrete structures already visible and piles of construction materials scattered around the site. "Good morning, Tony." Constance greeted a strong black man of about 60, who was organizing some workers at the site. "Ms. Constance, good morning." He approached, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Is this the friend you mentioned?" "Yes, Richard Smith. He needs to start over and has goodwill to learn." Tony extended his calloused hand, which Richard shook, trying to show firmness. "Ever worked construction before, Richard?" "No, sir." "At least you're honest," Tony smiled. "Today you'll help unload the cement truck that's arriving. Then you'll assist the bricklayers, bringing materials to them. Pay attention to what they do, because one day you might be in their place." Richard nodded, feeling completely out of place. Constance said goodbye. "I'll be back to pick you up at 5. Have a good first day, Richard." And so, alone among strangers, his first day as another man began. The cement truck arrived soon after. Richard observed the other workers and tried to imitate them, positioning himself to receive the 50-pound bags. When the first bag was placed in his arms, he almost fell with the weight. His back immediately protested, muscles unaccustomed to real physical effort screaming in pain. But pride prevented him from showing weakness. Staggering slightly, he carried the bag to where the others were stacking them. "Steady your legs and keep your spine straight," advised Joe, who was working beside him. "Otherwise tomorrow you won't even be able to get out of bed." Richard tried to follow the advice with the second bag, and the third and the fourth. By the 10th, his arms were visibly shaking. By the 20th, he thought he would faint. And there were still dozens left in the truck. "Water break," announced Tony after an hour of continuous work. Richard collapsed next to a pillar, sweaty, breathless, with blisters already forming on hands unaccustomed to heavy work. Joe offered him a sip from his own water, as Richard's was already gone. "First day is always the worst," consoled his colleague. "The body gets used to it." Richard doubted it. He was sure he wouldn't survive until the end of the day, let alone 3 months at this pace. But when the break ended, he got up anyway, determined not to give up at the first challenge. The following hours passed in a blur of pain, sweat, and exhaustion. Richard carried bricks, buckets of mortar, heavy tools. He heard instructions he barely understood, technical terms he had never heard. He tried to absorb, learn, adapt, but his body and mind protested every minute. When Constance finally appeared at 5 o'clock, Richard was sitting on a concrete block, too exhausted to even lift his head. "How was the first day?" she asked, extending a bottle of fresh water. "Hell," he replied honestly, drinking the water in large gulps. "I don't know how these people do this every day." "These people," she emphasized with irony, "have no choice. For them, there's no option to quit and go back to a Park Avenue penthouse." Tony approached, cleaning his cement-covered hands on a cloth. "Your friend worked hard, Miss Constance, not strong but persistent. Didn't complain once." Richard felt an unexpected pang of pride at the simple compliment. "Will he be back tomorrow?" asked Tony. Constance looked at Richard, a silent question in her eyes. It was his chance to quit, to say this was madness, that he wasn't made for this kind of life. "I'll be back," replied Richard, surprising himself, "if you'll have me again." 7 o'clock sharp, confirmed Tony with a nod, before walking away to check the day's work. The bus back, Richard was so exhausted he could barely keep his eyes open. His entire body ached. His hands, once soft and well cared for, were now rough, with popped blisters and calluses beginning to form. "Why are you doing this?" he asked Constance, who was watching the landscape through the bus window. "What's your real objective?" She remained silent for a few moments before answering. "When my husband became ill, I tried all possible treatments. I spent every penny we had, sold our house, our possessions, mortgaged the future, and still it wasn't enough." Her voice was calm, without self-pity. "After his passing, I found myself on the street, literally. A former executive without a home, without family, without hope. It was ordinary workers, people invisible to the powerful, who extended a hand to me, who shared the little they had, who taught me the real value of being human." Richard listened attentively despite his exhaustion. "For years I nurtured resentment against you and everything you represented, until I found Gabriel." Upon hearing his brother's name, Richard straightened in his seat, ignoring the muscle pain. Gabriel was doing wonderful work with underserved communities on the North Shore, using technical knowledge to improve the lives of people society ignores. When I discovered who he was, I could hardly believe the coincidence. When was this? Where was he? Patience, Richard. That story is part of what you'll discover over the next few months. Constance lightly touched his injured arm. Gabriel helped me transform my hatred into purpose, to use my knowledge for something greater than accumulating wealth, and he made me promise that, if I ever had the chance, I would try to do the same for you. Was it Gabriel who planned this? The idea seemed absurd. No, Constance smiled. Gabriel never knew that one day our paths would cross. That part was the work of fate, or perhaps, who knows, something deeper. The bus stopped at the point near the village. They got off and began walking along the trail that led to the shack. Tomorrow will be another difficult day, warned Constance. And then another and another. Your body will protest, your mind will beg to quit, your pride will suffer constant blows. The question is, how much do you really want to discover the truth about your brother? About yourself? Richard looked at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and red. More than you can imagine, he finally answered. That night, he fell onto the improvised bed without even having dinner, his body overcome by the day's effort. His last thought before falling asleep was the image of Gabriel's face, his boyish smile, his eyes that always seemed to see beyond appearances. "I'll find you, brother," he murmured before sleep took him. Days turned into weeks. Each morning, Richard woke up with an aching body, but less so each time. Muscles he had never properly used before were beginning to respond. His hands, once soft and well cared for, were now calloused and strong. His face, once protected in air-conditioned environments, gained a tanned tone from the constant sun. At the inn construction site, Richard progressed slowly. From a simple material carrier, he moved on to helping the bricklayers more directly, learning to prepare mortar to the right consistency, to position bricks to understand the basics of construction. "You've got a knack for it, Smith," commented Tony after 3 weeks, using the fake surname that now seemed almost natural to Richard. "You learn fast." Those simple compliments, which in his previous life would have been insignificant, now filled Richard with a different kind of pride. It wasn't the pride of closing million-dollar deals or seeing his photo in business magazines. It was something more basic, more human, the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. His interactions with co-workers also evolved. At first, he kept his distance, uncomfortable with the simple language, the crude jokes, the stories of lives so different from his. Gradually, however, he began to open up, to really listen, to understand that behind those simple stories was wisdom and dignity he had never recognized. "My oldest son got into college," Joe told him one day during lunch, his eyes shining with pride. "First in the family, civil engineering at the state university. I worked 2 jobs for 10 years to pay for his prep courses." "Congratulations," replied Richard sincerely. "It must have been very difficult." "Every second was worth it. He's already in his 3rd year doing an internship. Last month he brought me here, wanted to see his dad working. You know what he said? That when he graduates, he'll hire me as a consultant. Me who barely finished high school." Joe laughed, discreetly wiping away a tear. "That boy will go far." Richard felt something strange in his chest, a mixture of admiration and shame. Throughout his career, he had never valued stories like that. To him, people like Joe were just numbers on a cost spreadsheet, easily replaceable, disposable when necessary. At night in the small seaside shack, Constance and Richard developed a routine. They had dinner together, simple but tasty food that she prepared. Afterward, they talked, not about the past or about Gabriel. Constance saved that topic for the right moment. They talked about the day, about the people Richard was meeting, about the small discoveries he was making in this new life. "Today, one of the bricklayers, Mark, invited me to a barbecue on Sunday," commented Richard while washing the dishes, another task he had never performed in his previous life. "His daughter is having a birthday. He said the whole crew will be there. And will you go? Asked Constance, organizing some books on the small improvised bookshelf. I don't know. It would be strange. I don't belong in that world. And what world do you belong to now, Richard Smith? The question caught him off guard. At the beginning of this journey, the answer would have been obvious. He belonged to the world of business, of power, of money. But now, after almost a month living a completely different life, certainty began to falter. I don't know, he finally admitted. I don't know who I am anymore. Constance smiled as if this answer was exactly what she expected to hear. It's a good start. That night, Richard dreamed of Gabriel again. But this time, it wasn't the teenager who had left decades ago. It was a mature man working in a simple community, teaching children. In the dream, Gabriel turned and saw him, smiled, a smile without resentment, without accusations, just recognition. Richard woke up with tears in his eyes. On Sunday, he decided to go to the barbecue. At Mark's small house, he met entire families who lived on less than he spent on a single meal at starred restaurants. He saw children happy with simple gifts. He observed the community coming together to celebrate, sharing the little they had with genuine generosity. An elderly lady, Mark's grandmother, sat next to him as he watched the children playing in the small backyard. You have a sad look, young man, she commented, offering him a piece of cake, like someone who lost something important. Richard accepted the cake with a polite smile. I think I did, yes. Family? He hesitated before answering. A brother. A long time ago. The lady nodded, understanding. You know, my son also disappeared for 15 years. Nasty fight with his father, both too stubborn to give in. She looked beyond the yard as if seeing the past. One day he came back, a grown man with children, this very one who's having the barbecue. Mark? Yes, his father had already passed, but at least I could embrace my son again. She touched Richard's arm gently. When the heart is ready, paths open. Perhaps your brother is just waiting for that moment. Those simple words, from a stranger who knew nothing about his real story, touched Richard deeply. Could it be possible that Gabriel was also waiting for a moment of reconciliation? That after all these years, there was still a chance for a new relationship between them? The sun was beginning to set when Richard decided to return to the shack. He said goodbye to everyone, thanking them for their hospitality, surprising himself with the sincerity of his own feelings. Those people who a month ago would have been invisible to him now had names, stories, dignity. On the way back, he stopped at a small hill overlooking the sea. The sky painted in shades of orange and red reflected in the calm water. His previous life seemed increasingly distant, like a movie he had watched, not a reality he had lived. What am I doing here? He murmured to himself. What am I really looking for? The answer seemed to slip through his fingers every time he thought he was close to it. Gabriel? Redemption? A new meaning for his existence? Upon arriving at the shack, he found Constance on the porch, reading by the light of a lantern. She raised her eyes from the book and observed his thoughtful expression. The barbecue made. You think? Everything here makes me think, admitted Richard, sitting in the wooden chair beside her. I've been living a month as these people, and I already feel physically exhausted, but mentally, it's as if something is awakening. And imagine living like this your whole life, replied Constance, closing the book, without the certainty that in 3 months everything will return to normal, without the safety net of a financial empire, awaiting your return. Richard nodded, understanding the privilege his situation represented even under these circumstances. When will you tell me about Gabriel? He finally asked. A month has passed. When the time is right. Constance stood up. For now I have something different for you. Tomorrow you won't go to the construction site. Why? Did I do something wrong? On the contrary, you've progressed faster than I expected. She went into the shack and returned with an envelope. Tomorrow there's a meeting at the Shell Harbour Residents Association. I want you to come with me. What's there? The next stage of your journey. Constance handed him the envelope. Read this before you sleep. Tomorrow we'll talk more. Inside the envelope, Richard found old newspaper clippings, articles about a social project in coastal communities, photos of simple houses being renovated, water collection systems being installed, small community gardens, and in one of the photos, partially visible, a man who made his heart race. Gabriel, older, more mature, but undeniably his brother. Shorter hair, well-trimmed beard, but the same eyes, the same smile. The caption simply said, "New Horizons Project completes 5 years of activities on the North Shore of Massachusetts." Richard spent hours studying that photo, looking for more details, more clues, but that was all the clipping revealed. Sleep was slow to come that night, and when he finally dozed off, he dreamed again of his brother, this time working side by side with him, building something important. Something they had both lost a long time ago. Shell Harbor was about an hour by bus from the small community where Richard and Constance lived. It was larger, more structured, with a small commercial center, a municipal school, and a health post. Still, it was far from being a tourist or developed city. They arrived early at the headquarters of the Residents Association, a simple hall, painted light blue with posters announcing community events, vaccination campaigns, and parent-teacher meetings. "What exactly are we doing here?" asked Richard, as Constance guided him inside the place. "You're going to learn about your brother's legacy." The phrase caught him off guard. Legacy. The word carried a weight he couldn't completely decipher. Inside the hall, several people were arranging chairs in a circle. Some carried folders, others were affixing maps and diagrams to the walls. An older man with grey hair and thick-rimmed glasses approached as soon as he saw them. "Constance, glad you came." He embraced her warmly before turning to Richard. "And this must be the friend you mentioned." "Richard Smith," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Anthony Martin, coordinator of the New Horizons project." The man shook, his hand enthusiastically. "Constance said you have experience in management and are interested in our work." Richard shot a surprised look at Constance. She hadn't mentioned anything about this. "Yes, I have. Some experience," he replied cautiously. "I'd like to learn more about the project." "Great, great." Anthony picked up a folder from a nearby table and handed it to Richard. "Here's our institutional presentation. We're completing 12 years of activities this month." Richard opened the folder and found photos, graphs, and texts detailing the project's work. Housing improvement actions in underserved communities, alternative water collection systems, community gardens, professional training, handicraft cooperatives, and sustainable fishing. "Impressive," he commented sincerely. "You do a lot with few resources." "That was always Gabriel's motto," replied Anthony with a nostalgic smile. "Do the extraordinary with the ordinary." Richard felt his heart race upon hearing his brother's name pronounced so naturally. Gabriel? The founder of the project, Gabriel Montgomery. Anthony pointed to a framed photo on the wall that Richard hadn't noticed before. There was his brother, smiling alongside a group of volunteers, holding a sign that said, "New Horizons Inauguration." The date in the lower corner indicated the photo had been taken 12 years ago. "Your mum knew him well?" asked Richard, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Like a son," replied Anthony, and there was genuine emotion in his voice. "He arrived here more than 20 years ago, a brilliant young man who had abandoned a privileged life in New York, said he wanted to make a real difference, not just talk about it." 20 years, right after the fight that separated them. While Richard was building his business empire, Gabriel was building another kind of legacy. And where is he now? The question that consumed him finally escaped his lips. A shadow passed over Anthony's face. Constance quickly intervened. "Richard, how about we help organize the materials for the meeting? Anthony needs to receive the other participants." Before he could protest, she pulled him to a more secluded corner near a table with scattered documents. "What's going on?" whispered Richard, frustrated. "Why did you bring me here if I can't ask about Gabriel?" "Because you need to understand his work before you understand his fate," replied Constance in a low voice. "Observe, listen, learn. The answers will come at the right time." The meeting began shortly afterward. Representatives from 5 different communities discussed ongoing Projects, challenges, priority needs. Richard observed, impressed with the organization, the technical knowledge, and especially the mutual respect that permeated all interactions. These were not passive recipients of superficial charity. They were protagonists of their own transformation, using shared knowledge and resources to improve their communities in a sustainable way. During a break, a young woman approached. She was about 30, with curly hair tied in a bun and intelligent eyes that studied Richard with curiosity. "You must be Richard. I'm Julia Pratt, coordinator of the professional training area." "Pleasure, Julia." Richard shook her hand, noticing the calluses similar to those that now marked his own palms. "Constance said you have experience in business management. We need someone who can help our handicraft cooperative improve its business model. Interested?" Richard hesitated. It was the first time since the beginning of this journey that someone suggested he use his real skills, not just his physical strength. "I can try." "Great. Come with me." Julia took him to a smaller room, where 3 women and 2 men were waiting for him. "Representatives of the cooperative," she explained. They produced handicrafts with recycled materials and natural resources from the region, but faced difficulties in adequately pricing, managing inventory, and accessing broader markets. "What's your experience in the field?" asked one of the women, Mrs. Marlene, observing him with suspicion. Richard hesitated. He couldn't reveal his true identity, but needed to offer something credible. "I worked in the administration of medium-sized companies in New York," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "I know the basic principles of financial management, marketing, and product development." It wasn't a lie, just an extreme simplification of his experience as CEO of a billion-dollar conglomerate. For 2 hours, Richard listened to the cooperative's challenges. He analyzed their simple spreadsheets, examined their products, understood their production process, and then, almost without realizing it, he began to do what he had always done best: identify problems, propose solutions, outline strategies. "You're underpricing these products," he explained, pointing to woven straw bags with shell details. "The sustainable crafts market values the story behind the product as much as the product itself. You need to better communicate the social and environmental impact of what you do." The suspicious eyes began to shine with interest. The questions multiplied. Richard found himself drawing a simplified business plan on a whiteboard, explaining concepts of scalability, added value, and brand positioning in accessible terms. When the meeting ended, Mrs. Marlene, who had observed him with such suspicion, initially shook his hand enthusiastically. "It's been a long time since we had new ideas like this. You'll come back, won't you?" Richard looked at the hopeful faces around him and felt something strange in his chest, a satisfaction different from anything he had experienced in his career. It wasn't the pleasure of closing a $1 million deal or beating a competitor. It was the pure and simple sensation of being truly useful. "If you want me to, yes, I'll come back." On the way back to the shack, Richard remained silent, processing the experience. Constance respected his moment of reflection until they reached the shack. "What did you think of the project?" she finally asked as she prepared tea. "Impressive," admitted Richard. "It's small in scale, but the impact is much greater than I imagined. Those people are really transforming their communities." That was Gabriel's goal, not to create dependency but autonomy, not to offer charity but tools. Richard accepted the cup of tea she offered him. "Why didn't you tell me Gabriel founded the project?" "Because you needed to see for yourself. Understand with your own eyes, not through my words." "And now? What happens now?" The question contained all the doubts consuming him. Constance sat down across from him, her eyes fixed on his. "Now you have a choice, Richard. You can continue just as an observer, fulfilling the 3 months of our agreement to obtain the answers you seek about your brother. Or," she made a significant pause, "you can really get involved. Use your skills, your knowledge, your experience to contribute to his legacy." "I want to help," he replied without hesitation, surprising himself. "But I still want to know where Gabriel is. Why he's no longer leading the project he founded. Constance nodded slowly. In due time, Richard. First, you need to truly understand what he built, and perhaps in the process, rebuild something in yourself. That night, lying in his simple bed, Richard mentally reviewed the day, the stories he had heard about his brother, the almost reverential respect with which people spoke of him, the tangible impact of his work. He felt a mixture of pride and shame. Pride in what Gabriel had accomplished, shame for never having valued this form of success. In his business empire, Richard measured success in numbers, profits, acquisitions, market value. In the world Gabriel had built, success had faces, names, stories of real transformation. Who really left a legacy, brother? He murmured to the dark ceiling. You or me? The answer no longer seemed as obvious as it would have been a few weeks ago. 2 months had passed since Richard was saved from the waters by Constance. His body was transformed, stronger, more resistant, tanned by the constant sun. His hands, once soft, now sported calluses from real work. But the greatest transformation was happening internally. 3 times a week, he continued working at the inn construction with Tony and the others. He had progressed from a simple helper to an apprentice bricklayer, mastering basic construction, techniques he never imagined learning. On other days, he dedicated himself to the New Horizons project, especially the handicraft cooperative. That Saturday morning, Richard anxiously waited in the small square of Shell Harbour. It was the day of the first fair organized under his guidance. Colorful stalls were neatly aligned, displaying handicrafts with new packaging, professional labels, and prices appropriate to the real value of the work. Julia approached, carrying her clipboard. Already, Richard. Tourists are already arriving from the hotels and inns in the region. Are the artisans prepared for the approach we practiced? Yes, we followed exactly the script you suggested. Product story, social impact, sustainability, all without sounding like a rehearsed speech. Richard nodded, satisfied. In recent weeks, he had applied his marketing and sales knowledge to enhance the cooperative's work. They weren't manipulative tactics, as he had often employed in his corporate life, but transparent strategies to communicate the real value of that work. The fair was an absolute success. By the end of the day, almost all the inventory had been sold. Revenue exceeded 3 times the cooperative's previous best result. More importantly, new contacts were established with retailers from New York and Boston, interested in reselling the products. Mrs. Marlene, with tears in her eyes, hugged Richard tightly. In 30 years of crafting, I've never seen anything like this. We're finally receiving fair value for our work. Those simple words moved Richard more deeply than any compliment he had received in his corporate career. He felt truly useful, part of something meaningful. Anthony, the project coordinator, approached as the fair was being dismantled. Impressive, Richard. In a few weeks, you've revolutionized our commercialization area. Gabriel would be proud. Mention of his brother, as always, made Richard's heart race. When will I know what happened to him, Anthony? Everyone speaks of him with such affection, but always changes the subject when I ask where he is. The old coordinator studied Richard for a long moment, as if evaluating something important. Constance said the right time would come for this conversation. I believe we're approaching it. Anthony checked his watch. Come to my house tomorrow night. I have something to show you. On the way back to the pie shack, Richard felt divided between satisfaction with the fair's success and anxiety about the promised conversation about Gabriel. Constance noticed his state of mind. Something worrying you? She asked as they walked along the trail leading to the beach. Anthony invited me to his house tomorrow, said he has something to show me about Gabriel. Constance nodded, showing no surprise. He consulted me about this. I agreed that you're ready. Ready for what exactly? The frustration was evident in Richard's voice. Why so much mystery about my own brother? Because some truths need preparation to be received, Richard. It's not just about hearing, but about understanding. And to truly understand, you first needed to live what you've lived these 2 months. Richard stopped walking, facing her. He's dead, isn't he? That's what no one wants to tell me. Constance's expression remained serene, impossible to read. Go to Anthony's house tomorrow. All your questions will be answered. The night was long for Richard. Sleep was slow to come, and when he finally dozed off, he dreamed of Gabriel again. This time they were both young, before the fight that separated them. They were talking by a lake as they used to do in adolescence. Gabriel was saying something important, urgent, but Richard couldn't hear his words. It was as if an invisible barrier blocked the sound. He woke up frustrated with the feeling of having missed something crucial. The next evening, Richard headed to Anthony's house in Shell Harbour. It was a simple but comfortable building, surrounded by a small, well-kept garden. Anthony received him on the porch, offering him a rocking chair and a glass of lemonade. "Constance told me your real story," said the old coordinator without preamble. "Richard Montgomery, the missing tycoon, Gabriel's brother." Richard felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. She shouldn't have done that. On the contrary, it was necessary for what I'm going to show you now. Anthony stood up and went into the house, returning minutes later with a carved wooden box. "Gabriel left this for you." Richard looked at the box, incredulous. "For me? How could that be? He didn't even know where I was." "He always knew exactly where you were, Richard. He followed your career from a distance. Your successes, your acquisitions, your growing power." "Did he hate me?" The question escaped as a painful whisper. "No." Anthony pushed the box toward him. "Never. And this is the proof." With trembling hands, Richard opened the box. Inside, he found a leather-bound notebook with the inscription, "For my brother when he's ready." Beside the notebook, there was a flash drive and some old photos of the two together in adolescence. "What is this?" "Gabriel's diary. And on the flash drive, all the projects he developed, including some specific to your company. Ideas he never had the courage to present directly to you." Richard opened the notebook with reverence. Gabriel's familiar handwriting covered the pages, organized by date. The first entry was from shortly after his disappearance, more than 20 years ago. "I'll leave you alone with this," said Anthony, rising. "Take all the time you need." Richard barely noticed when the old coordinator entered the house. He was completely absorbed in his brother's words. Gabriel described his journey after leaving the family home, his initial disillusionment, the temporary jobs, the encounter with a university professor who introduced him to community development, the discovery of his true vocation. At no point was there anger or resentment in the words, just a deep sadness for the rupture with his brother and a persistent hope for reconciliation. "Richard has always seen success by the numbers and I by the faces," Gabriel wrote in one entry. "We're not as different as he thinks. We both want to build something lasting. We just chose different materials." Tears flowed freely down Richard's face as he read. Entry after entry, year after year, Gabriel had documented his achievements, his challenges, and frequently reflections on his distant brother. "I saw Richard on the cover of Forbes today," said an entry from 10 years ago. "The new titan of American business. His look was different, harder, colder. I wonder if he's happy, if he found what he was really looking for." And then Richard came to an entry dated 5 years ago that made his heart stop. The doctor confirmed, "Today. The diagnosis is not good. Months, maybe a year. I haven't told anyone yet. There's so much unfinished work, so much I still want to do. And Richard, my brother whom I never stopped loving, will never know how many times I wanted to reach out to him. How many times I got to the door of his office and turned back. Pride is a worse disease than the one consuming me now." Richard closed the diary, unable to continue reading. The pain was unbearable. Gabriel had fallen ill. Gabriel had passed away, and he in his corporate ivory tower had never known, had never had the chance for reconciliation. "No," he murmured, hugging the diary to his chest. "It can't be like this." Anthony silently reappeared on the porch, sitting beside Richard. "He fought bravely," said the old man, his voice gentle, "continued working as long as he could, never lost hope that one day you would find your way here." "How?" asked Richard, his voice choked with tears. How could he know? He didn't know. He hoped, trusted. Gabriel always had an unwavering faith in people, even those who disappointed him, especially in you. Richard took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. And Constance? How does she fit into all this? She and Gabriel worked together for years. When he became ill, she took on many of his responsibilities, and it was to her that he entrusted the most important mission: finding me. If it was possible, if fate allowed it. Anthony smiled sadly. Gabriel used to say that the universe has mysterious ways of closing incomplete circles. Richard looked again at the diary, at the photos, at the flash drive that contained the projects his brother had developed with him in mind. I can't believe it's too late, that I'll never see him again. Anthony slowly rose. Finish reading the diary, Richard, to the end. Then we'll talk more. Left alone again, Richard resumed reading, each of Gabriel's words a mixture of pain and comfort. The last entries documented his treatment, the progress of the disease, his reflections on life and the imminent departure. And then, the last page, dated just 2 years ago. The experimental treatment is working. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. 4 months without disease progression. Maybe I have more time than I thought. Time to strengthen the project. Time to, perhaps, find courage for what I never did. Constance insists I should reach out to Richard, that life is too short for foolish pride. Maybe she's right. Maybe it's time to close this circle. Richard turned the page, expecting to find more, but it was the last entry. Frantically, he searched the rest of the notebook, looking for any additional indication. At the end, an envelope was glued to the back cover. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside, a simple card with a single handwritten phrase. When you're ready, ask Constance about the island. Richard jumped up, his heart pounding in his chest. The island? What island? Was Gabriel alive? Was it possible? Anthony reappeared, as if he had guessed that Richard had finished reading. You found the envelope. What does this mean? Ask Constance about the island. Is Gabriel... Richard could barely formulate the question, fearing both hope and disappointment. That's something only Constance can answer. Anthony smiled enigmatically. Your journey is almost complete, Richard, but there's still a final chapter. Richard barely remembered how he got back to the shack that night. The path he normally traveled with attention and care passed in a blur as his mind processed everything he had discovered. Gabriel had become seriously ill. He had undergone an experimental treatment. There was a possibility Constance was waiting for him on the porch, as if she knew exactly when he would arrive. Without words, Richard showed her the card found in the diary. The island, he said simply. What does it mean? Constance looked at the dark sea, illuminated only by the reflection of the full moon. It means that the time has come to conclude your journey, Richard. She turned, facing him with an intensity that seemed to penetrate his soul. Tomorrow, at dawn, we will depart, and all your questions will finally be answered. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stayed on the porch, contemplating the ocean, full of possibilities both wonderful and terrifying. The same sea that had almost taken him 2 months ago now seemed to promise answers. Answers that could change everything. The day dawned with perfect serenity. The sea was calm, almost without waves, like a mirror reflecting the clear sky. Richard was already awake when Constance came out of her room, dressed in simple but noticeably better clothes than she usually wore. Are you ready? She asked, serving coffee for both of them. To find my brother? If he's alive, yes, more than I've been in my entire life. Constance nodded, satisfied with the answer. Then let's go. They walked to a small natural anchorage, where a man was waiting for them in a modest but well-maintained fishing boat. Good morning, John, greeted Constance. This is Richard. We're going to the island. The fisherman, a middle-aged man with sun-weathered skin, nodded without asking questions. He helped them board, and soon they were sailing on the calm sea. What island is this? Asked Richard, watching the coast recede. A sanctuary, replied Constance. A place of healing. and new beginnings. Gabriel found it 5 years ago when he was looking for locations to expand the project. It was an abandoned private property, a former marine research station. He bought it with his life savings. For what? Initially, to create an environmental studies center. Later, when he became ill, it became his refuge during treatment. Richard stared fixedly at the horizon, looking for any sign of land. Is he still there, alive? Constance didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. The island became more than a refuge, Richard. It became a symbol of the second chance Gabriel received, of the opportunity to complete his life's work. And what was that work? Building bridges between communities and resources, between knowledge and need, and perhaps most importantly, between two brothers who lost their way back to each other. After almost an hour of navigation, the island finally appeared on the horizon. It wasn't large, perhaps a square kilometer, but its beauty was impressive. Lush vegetation covered most of the area, descending to a small beach of clear sand where a wooden pier extended into the sea. As they approached, Richard saw a main building in the center of the island, a 2-story house in a rustic but elegant style, and some smaller buildings scattered among the trees. John docked the boat with the precision of someone who knew the place well. Constance disembarked first, followed by Richard, whose heart was beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from his chest. "Is he here?" he asked again, unable to contain his anxiety. "Patience, Richard. Just a few more minutes." They climbed a well-maintained trail that led from the pier to the main house. Wildflowers and medicinal plants grew in an organized way on both sides, forming a natural garden that seemed both decorative and functional. The house's porch offered a panoramic view of the sea. Richard immediately noticed the access ramp beside the steps, an adaptation for someone with reduced mobility. "Did Gabriel have sequelae from the disease?" he asked, indicating the ramp. "The treatment was effective, but it exacted its price," replied Constance as they climbed. "Some battles leave visible scars, others invisible. Gabriel carries both." She knocked softly on the door. Slow steps were heard from inside. Richard held his breath. The door opened, and there he was. Gabriel Montgomery, older, thinner, leaning on a cane, hair now completely grey, skin pale from someone who had spent a lot of time confined. But the eyes were the same, intense, intelligent kind. The eyes Richard had known since childhood. Richard. Her single word, pronounced with a mixture of emotions so complex it would be impossible to decipher them all. Surprise, joy, apprehension, hope. Gabriel. Richard felt his legs weaken. 2 months of preparation, of transformation, of discoveries, and yet nothing could have prepared him for this moment, for the impact of seeing the brother he believed lost forever. Constance discreetly stepped away, leaving the brothers alone. "You're alive," Richard finally said, his voice choked with emotion. "All these years, why did you never reach out to me?" Gabriel smiled sadly. "I did reach out, Richard, many times. I got to the door of your office on 3 different occasions, but I always turned back at the last moment. Why? At first out of pride, later because I saw the man you had become, so different from the values our father taught us, so consumed by power and ambition." Gabriel gestured, inviting Richard to enter. "I thought there was no more room in your life for an idealistic brother and his lost causes." Richard entered the house, observing the simple but comfortable environment. Books filled the shelves, a large table covered with maps and projects occupied the center of the room. On the walls, photos of the communities served by the project, and surprisingly, newspaper clippings about Richard's career. "You followed my life," he noted, approaching the framed articles. Every step. Gabriel sat in an armchair, resting the cane beside him. "Your triumphs, your awards, your acquisitions, and I observed with growing concern the price you seem to be paying for that success." Richard remained standing, still unable to relax. "And then you got sick." "Yes, a rare type of lymphoma. The doctors gave me months to live." Gabriel looked out the window toward the sea. That's when I realized I could leave this world without ever having really tried to rebuild our relationship. The thought was unbearable. Why didn't you reach out to me then? I would have paid for the best treatments, the best specialists. Gabriel smiled indulgently. And that's exactly why I didn't reach out, Richard. You would have thrown money at the problem, as you always did with everything. But it wasn't money I needed. It was a brother. The truth of those words hit Richard like a physical blow. Throughout his adult life, he had indeed treated every obstacle as a problem to be solved with financial resources. People, relationships, conflicts, everything had a price, a monetary solution. Constance told me you underwent an experimental treatment. Yes, in Switzerland. Advanced immunotherapy that was still in trials. It worked better than the doctors expected. Gabriel indicated the cane. Not without side effects, but I'm alive, in remission for almost 2 years. Richard finally sat down, his legs no longer supporting the weight of emotions. And now, after all this, after Constance finding me and taking me on this journey, what do you expect, Gabriel? Expect? Gabriel laughed softly. I don't expect anything, Richard. I don't have the right to expect or demand anything from you. Constance acted on her own in bringing you closer to the project, in showing you this other reality. I only knew when you were already immersed in the experience. I don't believe that, countered Richard, a touch of irritation arising for the first time. This whole elaborate plan, this 3-month experience, she wouldn't do that without your knowledge. Perhaps not without my knowledge, but certainly without my specific guidance. Gabriel leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his brother's. When I learned you were working at the construction site, living as Richard Smith, my first reaction was to ask her to stop everything, to reveal the truth. But Constance insisted that you needed this journey, that only by experiencing another reality could you truly understand. Understand what? The true value of things, Richard, of people, of relationships, of work that really transforms lives. Richard felt a wave of contradictory emotions, anger, gratitude, confusion, clarity. And who are you to decide what I need to understand, to manipulate me like that? No one, Gabriel replied simply. Just 2 people who believed there was more to Richard Montgomery than the ruthless billionaire the newspapers described. That perhaps under all the layers of power and ambition, there was still the boy who dreamed of building something meaningful. Silence fell between them, heavy with memories and expectations. Outside, the sea remained calm, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding. And now? Richard finally asked. What happens now? Gabriel smiled, the same warm smile Richard remembered from childhood. Now you decide, brother. You can return to your previous life, reclaim your empire, be who you've always been, or you can choose a different path. It doesn't have to be the same as mine, just more aligned with who you really are. And who am I really, Gabriel? Because after these 2 months, I'm no longer sure. That's the beauty of the journey. Richard, the opportunity to rediscover, to choose again. Richard stood up and walked to the window. From where he stood, he could see the entire extent of the small island, the sea beyond, and in the distant horizon, the mainland, his previous life. When I believed you were dead, he said without turning, I felt a pain I had never experienced before, not even when we lost our parents. It was as if a part of me had been torn away, a part I didn't even know still existed. And then, upon discovering you might be alive, it was as if everything else, the empire, the power, the money, suddenly seemed insignificant. Gabriel remained silent, allowing his brother to continue his reflection. In these 2 months, continued Richard, I've learned more about real value than in decades commanding billions. I've seen people with almost nothing material create more meaningful lives than executives with private jets. I've seen communities transform not with large investments, but with shared knowledge and mutual respect. He turned to face his brother. And most importantly, I've seen your legacy, Gabriel. the lasting impact you've created, the lives you've transformed. And I've asked myself, what will be my legacy? Scratching a few points in the GDP, having my name on a corporate building? Who will remember Richard Montgomery in one generation? In two? Gabriel stood up with effort, leaning on the cane. He approached his brother and for the first time since the reunion, touched his arm. It's not too late to create a different legacy, Richard. It never is. Richard felt tears in his eyes. How long had it been since he last cried? How do we begin, brother? How do we rebuild something that was broken so long ago? Gabriel smiled, his own eyes moist. The same way we rebuild anything in life, one day at a time, one brick upon another, with patience, work, and above all, love. And then finally, they did what they should have done decades ago. They embraced. An awkward embrace at first, laden with years of absence, of unspoken words, of divergent paths, but also an embrace of new beginnings, of possibilities, of bridges being rebuilt. When they separated, Richard felt as if an enormous weight had been removed from his shoulders, as if he could really breathe for the first time in years. "I have so much to tell you," said Gabriel, "so many projects to share. Ideas that could really make a difference if they had adequate resources. And I have so much to learn," replied Richard, "so much to relearn." The porch door opened softly. Constance entered, observing the brothers with a serene smile. "I see the bridges have begun to be rebuilt," she commented. Richard turned to face her, the woman who had saved him not just from the sea but from himself. "You were never homeless, were you? Not even when you lost everything?" "I lost everything material, yes," she replied, "but I never lost my dignity, my purpose. I went through very difficult times, lived on the street for a period, but I always refused to be defined by what I had or didn't have." "Why did you present yourself that way to me then? Why the charade?" "Because I needed you to really see me, Richard, not as a failed businesswoman seeking revenge, but as a human being you would normally ignore, someone invisible to the world you inhabited." Richard nodded, finally understanding, and it worked. For the first time in my life, I really saw people who had always been in front of me but whom I chose not to see. Gabriel rested his hand on his brother's shoulder. "And now that you see, Richard, what do you intend to do?" The question hung in the air, laden with possibilities. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was entirely open. A new path opened before Richard Montgomery, not the path of total abnegation that Gabriel had chosen, nor the path of unbridled ambition he had traveled until then, but something new, something that combined the best of both worlds. "I intend to build something that really matters," he finally answered, "something that makes a difference in people's lives, not just numbers on a balance sheet, but real transformations." Gabriel smiled and Constance nodded with approval. "And I intend to start by rebuilding what's most important." Richard extended his hand to his brother. "Our family." On the porch of that house on the small island, with the calm sea as witness, three people whom life had separated and reunited in unlikely ways contemplated a new beginning, a fresh start based not on power or revenge, but on understanding, forgiveness, and shared purpose. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. A new day awaited, and with it,